Vayoma Hashem el Moshe, Kach lecha es Yoshua bin Nun. Moshe is instructed to appoint Yoshua bin Nun as his successor. This is probably one of the biggest challenges in any position of leadership, whether it's rabbinic leadership or commercial or political leadership, to know when is the correct time and who to choose as a successor, and to groom the successor into a position that there shouldn't be a vacuum between one generation and the next. This is not a small matter, and possibly one of the hardest parts of any position of leadership. But Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Pinchas understands that Klal Yisrael are on the verge of entering Eretz Yisrael. They are encamped on the other side of the Jordan, ready to cross the Yarden, and he knows, he's been told by Kadosh Baruch Hu, that he, Moshe, is not going to be the leader of the next generation. So he wants to know, Yifkod Hashem Elokei Haruchos L'chol Basar, he davens to Kadosh Baruch Hu, please help me appoint the successor. And there are lots of very fascinating aspects to this parsha in Parshas Pinchas, but I'd like to touch on one or two of them. First of all, it's interesting to note in the Hebrew language that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Kach es Yoshua. This Hebrew word, Kach, Kuf Ches, in modern Hebrew, usually means a physical act of grabbing or grasping something. But in the Torah, it always means something else completely. Kach, says Rashi here, Kochenu bidvorim. Lakachat, in biblical Hebrew, means to take somebody verbally. What does it mean to take somebody verbally? It means to convince them, to urge them, to persuade them to take on a position which is not a simple change in their life, but it's something very worthwhile. That is really a very fascinating aspect of Kach, and it's used also to describe marriage, funnily enough. And the pasuk that says, Vayelech Ishmi Beis Levi, Vayikach es Bas Levi, it's talking about the parents of Moshe Rabbeinu, Amram and Yocheved. So what does it mean? He went Vayikach as Bas Levi. What does it mean he took her? It doesn't mean he abducted her. It doesn't mean he physically took her. It means he urged her and convinced her to marry him, or according to Chazal, to remarry him. This is, and in fact, repeatedly, the Torah uses for marriage, ki yikach ish isha chadasha, repeatedly uses the word yikach, which means always a verbal act of taking somebody, not physically, but mentally and spiritually, to urge them and convince them. In fact, the use of this word starts in Bereshis chapter 2, where the pasuk says, Vayikach Hashem Elokim, Vayikach Hashem Elokim es ha'odom vayanichehu began Eden la'ovda u'l'shomra. The job of Adam Rishon was in Gan Eden la'ovda u'l'shomra. Whatever that means, it's a larger parsha. Chazal say la'ovda u'l'shomra, la'ovda is mitzvahs aseh, u'l'shomra mitzvahs loisaseh. That HaKadosh Baruch Hu already gave mitzvahs to Adam Rishon, but he took him and he put him in Gan Eden. He wasn't created in Gan Eden. He was placed in Gan Eden and later on left Gan Eden. But Vayikach, says Rashi, what does Rashi say on Vayikach? Rashi says, Lokcho bidvorim, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu convinced, he had to urge Adam and Chava to go into Gan Eden. He had to urge Lokcho bidvorim, Noim upitehu likanes. Rashi uses a very interesting word that lakachat sometimes means, pitehu means to almost seduce somebody. In other words, to convince them to do something that maybe they are resisting, something which is hard, a difficult change in their life, but is definitely worthwhile. So Kaches Yoshua has got a very interesting aspect to it in human relationships, that often you need to convince somebody else to take on a position, and particularly a position of responsibility, a position which is not going to be easy, but is going to be was going to add a lot of value to their life. But this needs to be understood and to kach es Yeshua. What's interesting, lots of interesting details here. Rashi, the Balaturim, actually points out something fascinating, that in the original request for Moshe Rabbeinu is two psukim. Yifkod Hashem Elokei Haruchos L'chol Basar, Ish Alo Eda, Asher Yetze Lifneim, Asher Yova Lifneim. Says the Balaturim, in these two psukim there are 28 words. This is classic Bal HaTurim. He finds a remez in these two psukim of Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah, request to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that he should find a successor, 28 words which refer to the fact that Yoshua is going to live and going to lead Klal Yisrael for 28 years. And if you look at Sefer Yoshua, indeed Yoshua leads for 28 years. The first 14 are Kibush Haaretz, and the next 14 are Chalukas Haaretz. These were not easy 28 years to conquer and settle the land of Israel, but that was the power of Yoshua's leadership, and that was 28. And the Balaturim connects it to a pasuk in Devarim chapter 4, Ki hu hanosen lecho koach lasos choyel. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give you koyach. Koyach is 28. Kafches, hu nosen lecho koyach lasos choyel. That the choyel, the power which was required for the conquering and settling the land of Israel, that came from the 28 years of Yehoshua, which was rooted in the 28 words that Moshe Rabbeinu used in his tefillah to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he should find a worthwhile successor. Not an easy job, I must tell you. I've gone through this personally in my life not so long ago, stepping down from a position of Rabbonos in my Kehillah in London and finding the right successor. And it's not an easy job to find the right person and to groom him and to to put him in position. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chazdei Hashem, Baruch Hashem, we found a remarkable a young man to take over our Kehillah. And there's no greater sense of satisfaction for any leader than that of seeing his successor making a fabulous job of continuing the work that you've put your life into. And this is Moshe Rabbeinu's position here at the end, towards the end of his life, the last few weeks of his life. He's urging Yoshua, take this position. Now, what does he say? If it's a verbal challenge, what are the words that he uses? And here we find in Rashi a very interesting double message that Moshe Rabbeinu gives to Yoshua. So the first thing Rashi says, that when he takes Yoshua, the first thing he says is Ashrecha, be happy, rejoice, shezochisa liyos manhig shel bonov shel mokim, that you are going to play a role in leading the children of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, he impressed upon him the amazing status and ability to take a part in the leadership of the destiny of Klal Yisrael, and anybody who can take even a small part of leadership in a community, in any setting at all of leadership, becomes a link in the chain of the Masorah of Moshe and Yoshua, and that's Ashrecha. That's the first thing he says to him. But a few psukim later, Rashi brings down a second message that he says to him, V'tzivcha, tell Yoshua, tell him the truth. So there are two levels of truth. The first level of truth is that it is indeed a tremendous merit, a zechus, to be a leader of Klal Yisrael. But the second level of truth, Rashi there says, and there's almost a little bit of humor. I'm not sure whether Rashi purposely intends to be humorous at this point, but I certainly hear it as a certain of humor. The second Rashi is, tell him, you should know, shetarchonim heim, that they will drive you crazy. V'sarbonim heim, they will refuse to do what you tell them to do. Almanos came to Kabel. You've got to take the job with your eyes open, knowing that this is not going to be an easy job. The Jewish people are by nature independent-minded and opinionated, and they will not agree with you at all along the way. But nevertheless, like I'm convincing you to take the job, you will have to convince them along the way and teach them of the right derech, how to enter Eretz Yisrael, how to best conquer and settle the land, how to develop, how to transform actually Eretz Canaan into Eretz HaKodesh, how to transform the land into a source of Kedusha and to use Torah and mitzvahs in the optimum way to develop Eretz Canaan into Eretz Yisrael. And this was the challenge of Yoshua, and Moshe Rabbeinu sets him up, tells him the double message, if you like, which he needed very much, which he needed to hear. Behind the scenes here, Chazal tell us, though, another very interesting aspect of this choice, which contains within it a vital message that Klal Yisrael needed to hear. And that is, Klal Yisrael had already seen that the kahuna, that the priesthood, was dynastic. that you couldn't choose to be a Kohen, or for that matter, not to be a Kohen. If you were born into the right family, the kahuna was a dynastic, and still remains to this day, something which is part of the birthright of people born into families of Kohanim. So you might have thought that also the leadership of Klal Yisrael would be dynastic, and that in fact Moshe Rabbeinu would hand over to his sons. We know that he had two sons. Where are they? Why doesn't he hand over to them? And indeed later on we do find the idea of a dynastic malchus, but that only begins 500 years later, 400 years later, with David HaMelech. David HaMelech starts the dynasty of Malchus-based David. Before that, there were sheftim, there were leaders, but there was never a Malchus which was dynastic. But you might have thought at this point, and Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu did, he had a havamina, he had an assumption that maybe he could hand over to his children. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to him that because the leadership of Klal Yisrael is not just a political leadership. The leadership of Klal Yisrael is also a Torah leadership, and only someone who has applied himself in the most concentrated and dedicated way to learning Torah and understanding the full breadth and depth of Torah can be the leader of the next generation, and it's not B'Yerusha. Torah is not B'Yerusha. There's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos which says, Haskein atzmacha lilmod Torah, ke'eino Yerusha lecha. Torah doesn't come in a Yerusha. Torah is not dynastic. Torah is completely independent. In other words, it's open to everybody. The leadership in the Torah, indeed, throughout the history of Klal Yisrael, the Rabbanus, the field of rabbinic leadership, and indeed to be a member of the Sanhedrin, was open to anybody who made the grade, who was able to reach that level of intensity of understanding and knowledge that he could become a member of the Sanhedrin. And this started with Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is told that indeed, as the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos chapter 4 says, Shlosha Kesarim Heim. There are three different crowns, meaning three different sources of authority and leadership in Klal Yisrael. There is, of course, Keser Kahuna. There is the crown of the Kohanim, which is dynastic, which remains in the family, and there is later on also the Keser Malchus, the crown of the kingdom itself, which is also dynastic. But there is the Keser Torah, the crown of Torah, which is the primary source of authority and leadership in Klal Yisrael. That remains open to everybody. It's not elitist, it's not aristocratic, it's not dynastic. Every member of Klal Yisrael, if they apply themselves, can reach that position. So Moshe Rabbeinu is told here, you know that your sons may be lovely people, but actually Yeshua is the one, Shlo Mosh Mitocha Ohel, he was the one who was dedicated and concentrated to learn every word that you taught, and is able to pass it on to the next generation. And indeed we find in the Mishnah, famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, Moshe Kibul Torah Misinai Umasara LiYoshua, that the Torah in its entirety was of course taught to the whole of Klal Yisrael, but the leadership of Torah was handed over to Yeshua, and in that sense Yeshua becomes not only the political and military leader of Klal Yisrael, he also becomes the Av Bezdin and the head of the Sanhedrin and the head of the Torah, the Masorah of Torah for the next generation. And indeed, just to finish off with the beautiful insight of the Kli Yakar, the Kli Yakar notices that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, when you appoint Yeshua publicly, put one hand on him, right? You should put one hand, Yodecha, one hand. But when he actually does it, it says Yodov. He puts both hands on Yeshua when he publicly appoints him as his successor. Says the Kli Yakar, Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to make it clear to Klal Yisrael that both hands, the two hands that he's putting in Yeshua, one hand is the leadership of the military, economic, political leadership of Am Yisrael, which will be required in order to establish their new position in Eretz Yisrael. But the other hand is the leadership in Torah, that he will be the link, the next link in the Masorah of Torah, making sure that Klal Yisrael continue learning and transmitting and preserving the Kedusha of Torah, the details of Torah. And in that sense, in this little Parsha, we find a beautiful description of Moshe Rabbeinu taking responsibility for the next generation, taking responsibility for his successor, and encouraging him, urging him, winning him over giving him the message which will enable him to lead Klal Yisrael into the next generation, to conquer and settle the land of Israel, and to preserve the Kedusha of Torah, v'chein yehi ratzon.